Hi, I'm Hannah. This is Theology Therapist. Welcome. Today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about trauma and PTSD. I would say that there are big T traumas and there are little t traumas. Big T traumas are those life events that leave you changed forever. So death, assault, neglect, like those really big life happenings. Little T traumas are those life events that may happen more often and they are disruptive or painful. So things that could be little T traumas are like loss, difficult communication, poor boundaries, gaslighting on small scales, breakups, family dysfunction. That may feel obvious when I'm like kind of breaking them up into big T or little t, and you're like, yes, clearly assault is, different than poor communication or, something. But I think that colloquially we say often, I had a breakup and it was traumatic. Often when we say that, we're not meaning that we had a breakup and someone died or there was violence that happened, right? So, we kind of use those interchangeably when clinically they're quite different. So big T trauma is something that can develop into PTSD. Now, PTSD is a disease of non-recovery that is maintained through avoidance. Now, avoidance is a symptom of PTSD. Well, I'll talk about that in just a second. But the reason why I say that this non-recovery or this about PTSD is because one of the symptoms of PTSD is avoidance, right? Avoiding environmental, emotional, or sort of behavioral things that remind one of the event of what happened. And because one will work so hard to avoid any reminder of what happened, that the event itself isn't processed, it's not integrated into sort of a person's worldview or, their beliefs about themselves and others. And so because that's not addressed, then the PTSD is maintained, really. It's just kind of it's essentially just a vicious cycle. And so that's why it's not to say that it's fatal, it's not. And you can actually break out of that cycle of non-recovery. It's just that once it develops without proper attention, processing, then it will be the avoidance will maintain the PTSD symptoms themselves. Okay, so I want to take you through essentially diagnosis criteria for PTSD and kind of break down what that looks like or how that is related to trauma itself. Firstly, the first criteria for PTSD is that there has to be a stressor, right? So there has to be an event, there has to be a stressor, and that is defined as exposure to death, threatened with death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. And these stressors can happen in the following ways. It can happen through direct exposure, so this happens to you. It can happen through witnessing this happened to someone else. It can happen by learning of a friend or a family member who was exposed to a trauma. Or it can also happen through indirect exposure of learning of these events that happen to others. So think first responders, medical or mental health professionals, and this last one was actually recently added in the DSM for diagnosis. That's the first place that we start. So when we're thinking about PTSD treatment, we are thinking about, okay, what was the stressor, or was there a stressor of exposure to death, actual or threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence, right? So those are the things. And I think it gets a little bit tricky when we're talking about neglect. So neglect can happen a lot of times in early childhood when it does occur, and it can be really damaging, not only sort of psychologically, as we're talking about PTSD right now, but also developmentally, physically, right? So I think that neglect here is probably a little bit of a gray area, but I just wanted to have that as an aside. But by and large, these are those big T traumas. that we were talking about. If you are going to go receive treatment for PTSD, what you're going to first identify or meet is, what was that stressor? And you have to kind of, for a PTSD diagnosis, have to meet criteria of one of these things in order to receive treatment. Okay, so identifying the stressor is that first symptom. It's first criteria, essentially. And there's a list of criteria. I'm going to take you through it right now. I'm going to go kind of quickly through it because we don't need to spend a lot of time here. But I want to talk about all of the ways that, or just address all of the ways that PTSD can affect somebody. So we have criteria A. That was the stressor. Criteria B is that there has to be an intrusion symptoms. So an intrusion symptom is something that happens, it's intrusive, so it comes on in an unwanted way. So that could be unwanted or upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, or emotional distress or physical reactivity after exposure to traumatic reminders. Now, criteria C is the avoidance. So the avoidance, I talked about that before. You can exhibit avoidance of trauma-related thoughts or feelings, or you can exhibit avoidance of trauma-related external reminders. So think like if someone was mugged in the subway, maybe that avoidance is going to show up by avoiding taking public transit or going into the subway, right? So those are those external reminders. Criteria D is negative alterations in cognition, what you think, and mood. So this means that negative thoughts or feelings began or worsened after the traumatic event. And they worsened in these ways. Inability to recall features of the trauma. So there are some parts of memory that are inaccessible. Overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or the world. Exaggerated blame of self or others for causing the trauma. Negative affect, right? That's like our expressions. That's how sort of mood presents itself. That's what mood looks like, if you will. Decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, and difficulty experiencing positive affect. Okay, criteria E is alterations in arousal and reactivity. What that looks like is irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating, and difficulty sleeping. I think this can present itself in a lot of ways. So we're thinking like risky or destructive behavior. Sometimes what can happen after a trauma is, even reaching back to that criteria D that we were just talking about, there's often like negative beliefs about the self, about oneself. So what that does is impact maybe like the care, the care, the attention that you're willing to give towards yourself. So if there was a sexual assault, right? And if that happened early in life, or if that happened before someone had voluntarily or consensually had sex, so it was that first sex experience, what we see after that this doesn't always happen, but what can happen is that someone, criterion E, right, it can present as risky or destructive behavior. What can happen in that instance is someone may choose to have make risky sex choices, not use contraceptives, or not being able to giving consent inappropriately, right? Saying yes when really it's probably more appropriate to say no. Different power dynamics. So that first experience, having been so impacting the beliefs about themselves, may also impact their sort of making sort of safe versus risky choices, right? And then lastly, for diagnoses, there is always time requirements. So these symptoms have to last more than a month, and it has to cause distress or functional impairment. Like, it has to make living your life actually a bit more difficult. It has to make going about your day-to-day tougher. If you are experiencing those symptoms, that is going to happen. If you're meeting these criteria, going about your life is going to feel really difficult. And then there are 2 specifications. I wanted to mention them quickly because they can show up quite a bit, and they can be hard if you don't know what they are. They can be hard to even describe them, right? So the first one is a disassociation specification. So in addition to meeting criteria for the PTSD diagnosis that I just walked you through, and if someone meets criteria for the disassociation wow, why is that so hard to say? Disassociation specification, an individual experiences high levels of either of the following, these following two things, in reaction to trauma-related stimuli. So the first one is depersonalization. So depersonalization is the experience of being an outside observer or being detached from yourself. So that may look like feeling like something isn't happening to you, or you're in a dream, right? Having that out-of-body experience, right? Your body is here, but I feel like I'm like sort of up above looking down on you potentially, right? So, or having the feeling that you're like what's happening right now feels like a dream. That could be one way that disassociation presents itself. The second way is derealization, which is the experience of unreality, distance, or distortion. So that's the experience of things feeling like they're not real. And that maybe with my example of sexual assault and then risky choices, risky behaviors, that can line up, right? Like things not feeling real in the moment, especially even like as it relates to consequences. So that's one specification. The other is called delayed specification, which means that all of this criteria for PTSD isn't met until 6 months or later after the trauma happened. I wanted to walk you through PTSD because it can help to give some language to, one, speak to what is a traumatic event versus what is a tragic event. Breakup, right? If I have a breakup with somebody that I've been dating for 6-10 years, our lives were so intertwined, and all throughout the person was kind of, they would gaslight me, or their family didn't accept me, and they pushed my partner to break up this relationship, right? We might say it was a really traumatic experience, which, given that criteria that we just walked through, would not meet criteria for PTSD because it doesn't meet that first criterion of a stressor. But we would put other words to it, right? We might say that, we might call that tragic. We might call that unfair. We might, right? Like there are other things that we would say to it. But in some ways, right, when we're talking about little t trauma, it probably, like that would probably qualify as like a little t trauma. But when we're specifically thinking about PTSD, that's how we differentiate that, right? Now, how does all of this relate? Little t, big T, PTSD, how does all of it relate to religion and cults? So toxic religious communities and cult-like groups, they use psychological threats, specifically about, extended or ongoing torture or punishment after death to oneself or the people that you love, if strict rules or the authority had aren't followed. The other day I was watching the documentary on Netflix called Keep Sweet, and they were talking about Warren Jeffs, how Warren Jeffs, the leader of FDLS, stands for Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. So Warren Jeffs presented himself as essentially the authority had for, sort of like the new prophet. And he was going to be the person that led these followers into heaven or into the promised land or whatever. And there were serious and severe consequences for not following this authority head, right? For not following Warren Jeffs, or for disagreeing or disobeying, or, right? He had lots to say about loyalty and about obedience. So in cult-like groups, it can be kind of obvious for us from the outside to say, like, clearly that would be harmful. So the FDLS, the people who were a part of that group, they believed that Warren Jeffs was going to lead them to God, and that if they followed him, they would be a part of this group that was kind of lifted up from the earth and saved from while the rest of the earth, or the wicked people on earth, while there was burning that happened. And so it's clear here that even though the threat comes after death, right, that there is a clear threat of serious violence or death to oneself or to the people that you love here. And so that's kind of how that operates, right? Now, there can also be actual or threatened physical or sexual violence that happens in these groups, which also increases the likelihood of the development of PTSD. This happened in Boston for decades, throughout the 80s, 90s, and it really came to light in the early 2000s when the Boston Globe published an article about priests who had sexually abused children in the church, boys in the church. And so this has happened in this setting, right? So it's also happened in the yoga community of Bikram Yoga Studios, and he was convicted of rape and sexual harassment within the yoga communities that he created. I mentioned the yoga community here because I think in a lot of ways, yoga in particular, it has roots in religious traditions, and it does have a lot of similarities, I would say, as somebody who has gone through a 200-hour yoga teacher training. I would say it has quite a few similarities to actual religious communities. Threatened violence or threatened death, that can happen in religious communities, in cult-like communities, and it can be so extremely detrimental to the members of that community. It can happen also in the yoga community, right, where there is it's not explicitly religious, right, but there are these aspects of it that are quite similar. Basically, what I want to say is, here's this example of a toxic religious community, the FLDS, of how they used psychological threat of death, right? That's how this relates to religious and cult communities. Then there are instances where actual physical or sexual assault or abuse does occur. And the examples of that are, in Boston within the Catholic Church, and the priests there with the boys that they abused. And then in Bikram Yoga Studios with Bikram, who was convicted of rape and sexual harassment. And these are just 3 examples, but there are examples, probably all of us could come up with an example actually of how this is the case. And as somebody who identifies still as a person of faith, I think that it's just so sad, right? It's so sad that these things happen in religious communities that are really trying to create a space of vulnerability and depth, and they become exploited. One last note that is important, I think, to say, that someone could be resilient from trauma. So just because a traumatic event happens does not even mean that somebody is going to develop PTSD. The difference lies in how the traumatic event is incorporated into somebody's worldview, into their beliefs about themselves, others, and the world around them. So don't think just because a traumatic thing has happened or a terrible thing has happened that means that you're going to develop PTSD. It doesn't actually mean that, and we see the research shows that there are quite a few people, there's lots of people really, who have traumatic things happen to them and they're resilient through those. PTSD has been called a disease of non-recovery because of the pervasiveness and presence of avoidance, but that doesn't mean that it is impossible to recover, that it's fatal. It is possible to recover, and it's possible to be resilient. And I think that's one of the most important things to know about PTSD and after you've experienced a traumatic event, is that it is possible to recover and to take your life back. So whether you have experienced physical or sexual harm from someone in your life, or a member of your religious community, or your spiritual community, Or if you've had a hard time reintegrating back into society after you've left a fundamentalist or cult-like community, or you are wanting to leave but finding that difficult, it could be beneficial to you to talk with a licensed mental health or medical professional, a licensed therapist, to see if you do meet criteria for PTSD and to receive treatment for that, because that can change your life. It can be so empowering, and it can get some of those things that are making functioning on a day-to-day basis out of your way. PTSD treatment is like, there's like lots of brush on the ground, right? There's lots of stuff in the way. And PTSD treatment is really like trying to clear the brush out of the way so that you can address the symptoms and address the things in your life that you would like to address in order to make your life what you want it to be, in order to make your life the life that you want to live. But that can be extremely hard to do when you have all of this like stuff that's getting in the way. Maybe you want to leave the religious community, or maybe you've left and you're like, okay, I would like to not be afraid to show up in the world, to say what my opinion is, to be a powerhouse, to be, a woman who is in the workplace and isn't afraid to speak up, right? But you've been taught that you need to be the good girl, right? That personality of keeping sweet, the personality of not speaking up and deferring, right? And those are beliefs that are going to get in your way on a regular basis, and it's going to make it extremely harder for you to reach the growth and the potential that you would like to reach if you're still trying to address all that brush in the meantime. If you're in Massachusetts and you would like to reach out, if you'd like to schedule an initial consult, there is a link in the description. If you are not in Massachusetts, but you are interested in PTSD treatment or treatment for trauma and support in your life, I recommend you look through a therapy directory. You can look on Psychology Today or Therapy Den or Zen Care. They are all great options. I'm happy that you are here today. I hope that you found this helpful. Leave a note in the comment. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next week.